Welcome everybody to Sustainable River Basin Management, Module 4.2, Part 5. We've been talking about sustainability in river basin management and the techniques towards it. This time I want to focus on the aspect of coordination between state and non-state actors as one of the river basin management functions. Let's first start with a definition of stakeholder engagement. What we mean by stakeholder engagement is persons or groups who are directly or indirectly affected by a project, as well as those who may have interests in a project and or the ability to influence its outcome either positively or negatively. This definition comes from the International Finance Corporation. It shows us already in which fields stakeholder engagement has been perceived and considered as very relevant, very important, which is in business and economics. What we also see is that there are various aspects to the stakeholder engagement. First, that somebody may be affected by a project, not really be related to the project or benefiting from it specifically, but being affected directly or indirectly. The other relationship could be that somebody may have an active interest in the specific project. Again, that may not come especially from living and being affected by the project, but simply having an interest in it by contributing maybe in one way, a financial way, or by contributing knowledge to a project. That interest may arise, or the ability to influence the outcomes of a project. And again, that influence could be directly or indirectly. It could be positive or negative. So there are various aspects which bring together reasons for stakeholder engagement, which have to be understood. It doesn't explain stakeholder, and that's why we want to define what stakeholder is. Stakeholders may include locally affected communities or individuals and their formal and informal representatives, national or local government authorities, politicians, religious leaders, civil society organizations and groups with special interests, the academic community, or any other businesses. So those are all stakeholders which may be interested or affected or may have influence on the outcomes of a project, and at some stage will influence the outcomes, the success or the reputation of an undertaking. Now, stakeholders in water resources have become very important in the success of water resource management, and they were classified and differentiated in a slightly different way. We group them into core stakeholders, into so-called newcomers in the water sector, and so-called underrepresented groups, where we have our generic stakeholder definition. Some of these underrepresented groups may not even be accounted for properly if it comes to larger projects, larger undertakings in a specific region, whereas in the aspects of water, we know that water is important to all living beings, humans, ecosystems, economies, and in that it matters to bring underrepresented groups to the table and consider them as stakeholders and make sure that those stakeholders are involved at the respective levels of the stakeholder engagement. The other group, which is also usually not taken up so seriously and has become very important in water resources, are the so-called newcomers. Those are, for instance, property developers or long-term institutional investors, or newcomers in terms of economic activities in a specific region, which have a substantial influence on what is happening in the water sector or what is happening to the water demand in a specific region. And then we have the usual known and expected in the so-called core stakeholders, governments, service providers in water, the river basin organization, businesses, civil society, farmers, legislators, and trade unions. Those would come along and are fairly well established, are well visible also, and constitute the so-called core stakeholders. But those alone are not sufficient to make sure that all of the aspects related to water resource management will be covered and taken care of properly. This comes from OECD studies on water, very recent document of 2015, where this stakeholder participation, stakeholder engagement in water resource management was analyzed. Let's reflect upon engagement versus participation. Very often we hear about public participation. Participation is just a part of engagement. It does not entail that participants take part in any way in decision making and implementation. Participation may be simply to inform or to obtain agreements or to collect concerns which may or not be incorporated in decision making. It's also a way of venting emotions. So very often participation is just an opportunity where people can obtain more information, or they may even express an opinion, but that opinion may not really influence the outcome or the pathway of a larger project, for instance in water management. Whereas on the engagement side, it means that we expect stakeholders to contribute in a meaningful manner to the inputs of the process, in this case the water resource management related projects on their way to the implementation. So very often these public participation processes been very perceived as not very satisfying to people, because very often they feel they are wasting their time, or they have been made aware of something that has been decided somewhere else already, or that whatever they say is just to make something, to sign it off, to have a long list of people who have been stakeholders and have been heard, have a list of signatories, which at the end is just been attached to a final report, but not influencing how the reality is going to change and influence. So that's why this has been a matter of reflection, especially in the water sector, in the water management sector. So it's essentially a shifting from the response to water supply issues towards a collective decision making. Very often public participation is also concerned only with receiving complaints, managing complaints in various ways, and this is changing right now towards a more collective decision making in water management issues. So the reasons for the stakeholder involvement are manifold. first of all, remember that water governance is a highly fragmented sector, so it makes it very hard to implement projects in a very efficient way unless we involve the various stakeholders. Moreover, there's a growing complexity of water challenges, including multi-stakeholder demands, which have to be brought together to enable a project to function at the very end. And third, there are financial constraints of the public sector, and fourth, there is an increased demand from the citizens. We should not forget that the citizens are very often, or should be in most of the countries, taxpayers, and as such they are holding their governments accountable for how these payments are applied towards public services. So very often citizens are asking for an engagement because they want to know how public decisions are taken and how advancements are made. So just an example on the growing complexity. This is the Jordan River, just showing you the geographical location of the Jordan River, the Jordan Valley. You can see here the river flows through this lake, which has changing names. Here it is called Sea of Galilee. In other places, or other maps, it's called Lake of Tiberias. This has a headwater catchment in those mountain areas here, and there is a major tributary coming from this side, and then this flows southwards in a rift structure to the Dead Sea here in the south. So looking at this from a water management perspective, we have again the same map here in a simplified, in a sketched way. We have our lake here under this other name, and we have in the south our Dead Sea. And we have here, first of all, the different countries. We can see that we are having here 3 different countries sharing this river and sharing the catchment of the Jordan River. This was in the 1950s. And then we have here water amounts measured in the various parts and portions, upstream, midstream, and downstream portions of the River Jordan. What we can see is that major amount of water is reaching here the Dead Sea in the form of fresh water, and about 2/3 of the river water comes from this lake area in the north, and the rest comes from this tributary river joining the Jordan River here. And then we see that first of all the river forms a country border here between those 2 countries here, and we see some development happening, some development in the form of irrigation systems, plantations, agricultural production taking place, irrigated fields being developed in one part here on both sides of the Jordan River here, and a specific subcatchment development taking place in just one part of the river. So now this picture now changed dramatically from the 1950s to nowadays, 2000s, and it's not stopping. What we now see that we have more countries involved. There's a new country that came into being and now also shares the river as a country border on one hand side, and then we see that a major pumping station was installed on the lake, and land development here took place in a very large scale, abstracting water from the river and the tributaries at various stages to use and reuse intensively this water in various projects, and agricultural production in plantation, forest plantation or fruit tree plantations at large scale. And what we can see is that only a very minor portion of water is still reaching the Dead Sea. A minor portion, actually in the form of wastewater, is reaching the Dead Sea, and all of the fresh water has been diverted and used in various fields. What we can see is that a major portion of that water is being taken up by just one country of the 4 countries here, and there's a major uptake of water from the lake by just another one single country, and it essentially has interrupted the outflow, the discharge from that lake that used to contribute quite substantially to the Jordan River. This doesn't exist as such anymore. There's a freshwater release of remaining water from the lake, which has been sort of maintain some outflow from this lake into the Jordan, but most of it has been used and diverted into the country. So this is just an example of, first of all, how very complex water allocation, water management can be, and water budgets can be visualized, made a little bit more transparent. It also shows how complexity grows with time, with economic development, also with the change and the increase of the number of stakeholders, and that very often this relates to water security issues and stability issues in entire regions, like in this example here that we see here. Now, let's look into the purpose of stakeholder engagement. Why do we make efforts to involve stakeholders? And there's a special emphasis on the stakeholder engagement in the early stages of decision making, and this is considered as being very critical to secure support for reforms, to raise awareness about water risks and costs, and to increase water users' willingness to pay for services and the ability to manage conflicts. So those are essentially the purposes of why we bring stakeholders to the table, why we involve them, and why this should happen at the earliest possible stage of a water management project, a water undertaking. Now, what is the role of governments in this? Government should create an enabling institutional environment. It does not mean that governments, or suggest automatically that governments should do the job of running these stakeholder engagements. What is important is that governments create enabling institutional environments, and those should include conflict management. They should create space and the institutional environment for exchange of knowledge, exchange of data, information, and the institutional environment for decision-making processes to take place. So, in general, those are principles of good water governance. They are simply keys to success, but they're also key to legitimize governance. You remember that governance comes along with a constant, continuous proving of the capabilities of implementing and achieving good governance and delivering services to the citizens. Now, the kinds of water governance that we can see in river basins were plotted here in this figure. We can see 4 extreme examples, but very often we see transitional setups in river basins. But we can see on the 4 axes, first of all, the stakeholder axis here. We have a stakeholder-driven as one of the end members, and state-driven on the other side as an end member. And then we have centralized on one side and decentralized on the other side of this axis. And then we have a representation here of the government, the different institutions, different stakeholders in this. So in this case, the example is stakeholder-driven and decentralized. So we have a polycentric, so-called democratic governance platforms with brokering roles in between. We have on, if we move to the part of decentralized and state-driven, then we have the government body at the center with links into the from the national to the regional to the local levels, all represented. So it's a deconcentration of the state ramifications from the central, from the national to the local levels. In some countries, they exist at horizontal as well as the vertical levels. And then when we move to the centralized and state-driven portion of this representation, we would have a single central government state organ which is represented into the various levels at administrative levels, from the state to the province or union territories to the districts or the down to the ward levels. So those are unicentric state agencies concentrating extensive powers and roles in these individual arms here, and reporting back to the single state agency responsible for that. When we now go into the fourth of these quadrants, we have centralized and stakeholder-driven. In that case, we have again government in the center here and coordinating all of these activities, overseeing those activities, but handing over various aspects to different state agencies, but also different stakeholders, other stakeholders in that specific region. So there may be agencies with coordinating roles, allowing input from the stakeholders. Now let's look into the stakeholder strategy. How would we engage stakeholders? And for that we need a strategy. We first of all have to identify stakeholders and their motivations. We also have to identify responsibilities and conduct performance gaps in the water resource management sector itself. And from that performance analysis, we can identify the various roles of the stakeholders. We can also, from departing from this analysis, overcome the mismatch between administrative and the hydrological scales, which means we can fit stakeholder engagement to a place-based need. As you have seen, river basin can be very large, can be very complex, can include various states, various national transboundary issues, national issues, and can affect many different levels within the river basin from an administrative point, but also from a stakeholder impact point of view. And so in many cases, the administrative matter will be dealt at one level, maybe even far away from the actual river basin, whereas the hydrological issues of allocating water or water scarcity or water pollution are linked to the actual river basin and linked to the people who are every day affected and having to deal with the situation locally. So, which may not have the connection to that administrative stakeholder which is sitting outside the basin. So this requires adjustments, and this requires thoughts and strategies of how to engage all of them at the appropriate level, in the appropriate environment. We also have to identify appropriate mechanisms of involvement, and those mechanisms could be informal, they could be institutionalized, they could also include online platforms or some other more modern mean of involvement. We have seen one of the examples of online platforms earlier when I talked about decision support systems. Now, we also have to identify when and for what purpose to engage stakeholders. As we have seen in this example of the Jordan River, the number of stakeholders can become very complex, and this has to be managed appropriately so that the needs of all of the stakeholders can be addressed in the appropriate way. And to have a proper stakeholder strategy that also works, we have to make time available. Stakeholder engagement takes more time, and we have to make financial and human resources available for that stakeholder involvement. Now, why would we do that? There are certain benefits from the stakeholder engagement which were brought together by UN Water for Life initiative and the sharing of stakeholder experiences. What they came up with was that stakeholder engagement leads to adapted and more effective solutions. It also brings together experts, implementers, end users, and policymakers, which enables a knowledge exchange and enhancement. Remember that very often it's the end users, for instance, in the case of the women carrying water, safeguarding water, that they have the knowledge of what works locally, which technologies work, where the water actually is, what the water quality is. And then we have, on the other hand, experts and scientists and engineers, implementers, constructors, the politicians who can mobilize funds, who can create the enabling environment for things to improve, for things to change. It's important to bring those across together in appropriate ways, and in that way enhance the knowledge and the success of such projects. It also was perceived that as a benefit that there can be social inclusion achieved, and that social inclusion is a success factor for sustainable water management. Also was observed that once in cases where changes were achieved, those were the result of cooperative efforts, and that bundled knowledge or concentrating knowledge and resources can increase the effectiveness of many small initiatives, and in that way much more can be achieved from a smaller, scarce resource base that we have usually available today. At this point, I want to stop on the stakeholder engagement and the coordination of various stakeholders in the river basin management, and I see you next time again.